January 23, 1945, Stalag 7A, Moosburg, Bavaria. The train crawled eastward through the frozen German landscape, carrying men who had been taught they were liberators. Second Lieutenant Robert Bobby Harrison pressed his face against the cattle car's wooden slats, watching villages slide past, places with names he couldn't pronounce, populated by civilians who looked away as the train passed. Inside the car, 63 American airmen stood packed shoulder to shoulder, breath condensing in clouds, boots shuffling for warmth that wouldn't come. They had been briefed about this possibility: capture, interrogation, imprisonment, but the briefings had been abstract, clinical, focused on name, rank, serial number protocols and Geneva Convention protections. No one had prepared them for the reality, the cold, the fear, the humiliation of surrender, the terrible awareness that the war would continue without them. Harrison was 23, a B-17 navigator shot down over Schweinfurt 3 days earlier. His entire crew had survived the bailout, a miracle, everyone said. Now, watching Oberfeldwebel Hans Dietrich move through the car with stolid efficiency, checking for medical emergencies with neither kindness nor cruelty, Harrison wondered what kind of miracle deposited you in enemy hands with 3 years of flight training rendered instantly useless. Stalag 70A sprawled across former military training grounds south of Munich, acres of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers at intervals, a perimeter that looked almost casual until you noticed the machine gun positions in the clear kill zones. The processing took 6 hours. Each prisoner was photographed, registered, searched with meticulous German thoroughness that found every concealed item. Harrison lost a compass hidden in his boot heel and assigned to a barracks sector organized by rank and nationality. The Germans separated officers from enlisted men, Americans from British, from French, from Russians, maintaining order through categorization. It was efficient, disturbingly so. Oberfeldwebel Dietrich, 41 years old and a veteran of both world wars, watched the new arrivals with the assessment of someone whose job was containment without drama. He had been guarding prisoners since 1943, after injuries sustained at Stalingrad made him unfit for frontline duty. He had seen British prisoners who maintained rigid military bearing despite captivity, French prisoners who organized themselves along political lines, Russian prisoners who died in appalling numbers because the Reich considered them subhuman and fed them accordingly. But these Americans, the first large group he had encountered, presented something unexpected. They were young, most barely past 20, raised in a country that had never experienced occupation or systematic destruction. They should have been soft, undisciplined, demoralized by capture. Instead, they fell into formation automatically. When ordered to line up for roll call, they organized themselves by unit, rank clearly delineated, spacing perfect. When issued camp regulations in English, they listened with military attention, asked clarifying questions about male privileges and Red Cross access, took notes. When assigned barracks, they immediately established duty rosters, sanitation schedules, security watches, resource distribution. Dietrich watched a captain named Morrison organize 30 men into a functioning unit within 2 hours. No shouting necessary, just quiet competence and mutual respect for structure. It was disconcerting. The propaganda had promised that Americans were individualistic cowboys, barely organized, held together by material wealth rather than discipline. But these men moved like soldiers. Not German soldiers exactly, but soldiers nonetheless, with an institutional culture that apparently functioned even when stripped of equipment and freedom. Dietrich mentioned this to Hauptmann Weber, the camp commandant's adjutant, during evening report. Weber laughed. "Give them a week," he said. "Captivity breaks everyone eventually." Dietrich said nothing, but privately he doubted. These men had something, some quality he couldn't yet name, that suggested they wouldn't break easily. The first week confirmed Dietrich's suspicion. The American compound, Barracks Section D, housing approximately 400 officers, organized itself with speed that bordered on unnatural. They established a command structure: senior Allied officer, executive officer, section leaders, duty specialists. They created a sanitation protocol more rigorous than camp regulations required, digging proper latrines, establishing washing schedules, enforcing cleanliness standards that kept disease rates lower than in other sections. They formed an education committee that started classes in everything from engineering to languages to military history. They organized athletics, calisthenics every morning, competitive sports in the exercise yard, maintaining physical fitness as if preparing to return to combat at any moment. Lieutenant Harrison found himself assigned to the Intelligence Committee, a group tasked with gathering information about the camp, the guards, the surrounding area, anything that might be useful for escape attempts or eventual liberation. The committee met daily, compiling reports with bureaucratic precision, filing them in a hidden archive constructed inside a hollow bunk post. It was, Harrison realized, a military staff operation conducted in miniature, maintaining institutional memory and analytical capacity, despite having no actual power. The Americans were running their captivity like a garrison command. Dietrich observed all of this, because observation was his job. What struck him wasn't just the organization, the British were also well organized, but the nature of it. American discipline wasn't based on rigid hierarchy or fear of punishment. The officers led, but enlisted men in other sections showed similar self-organization. It was horizontal somehow, distributed, based on what Dietrich could only describe as internalized standards. These men disciplined themselves because they believed in the system, not because they feared consequences for deviation. When one soldier violated camp rules by stealing Red Cross supplies, his own unit held a hearing, determined guilt and imposed sanctions, extra duty, loss of privileges, before the German guards even heard about the incident. It was justice without coercion, order without oppression. They're running their own country in there, Dietrich told his wife during a rare visit home. She was practical, unsentimental about the war. Is that a problem? He thought about it. No, he said finally. It makes them easier to manage in some ways, but he struggled with the implication. But it suggests they come from a system that works. That produces this kind of soldier naturally, without requiring the things we require. She understood what he meant. The parades, the oaths, the constant reinforcement of hierarchy. The Americans seemed to maintain military discipline as if it were simply how civilized people behaved. March 1945, the first reversal of expectation. The Red Cross parcels arrived weekly when supply lines permitted. Boxes containing food, cigarettes, toiletries, sometimes books or athletic equipment. Distribution was supposed to be German-controlled, but the Americans requested permission to handle their own logistics, arguing they could be more efficient. Hauptmann Weber approved experimentally, curious to see if they would cheat, hoard, or create black markets. Within 2 weeks, the American compound had implemented a distribution system of remarkable sophistication, inventory tracking, equitable allocation formulas that accounted for medical needs and work assignments, surplus management, even a lending library for books and a rationing system for cigarettes that prevented addiction while allowing trade. Dietrich reviewed their distribution records. They kept written logs organized by date and recipient, and found them more detailed than German military supply documentation. How? He asked Captain Morrison, genuinely curious. Morrison shrugged. It's just logistics, Sergeant. We're pilots and navigators and bombardiers. We understand supply chain management. Also, he paused, choosing words carefully. In America, we don't assume resources will be distributed fairly by authority. We assume we need to organize ourselves to ensure fairness. It's cultural. That conversation lodged in Dietrich's mind. He was accustomed to thinking of discipline as top-down, orders flowing from command, obedience flowing upward. But American discipline seemed bottom-up, emergent from individual initiative constrained by shared values. They policed themselves not because they feared guards, but because they feared letting down their fellows. The distinction was subtle, but profound. It suggested different theories of human nature, whether men needed external control or could be trusted with internal standards. The reversal deepened when supply lines collapsed. By late March, Red Cross parcels stopped arriving. German rations, already inadequate, shrank further as the Reich's logistics disintegrated. Other sections of the camp descended into conflict, fights over food, theft, the breakdown of social order under starvation stress. The American compound tightened discipline. They implemented shared rationing where healthy men voluntarily accepted smaller portions, so medically fragile prisoners received more. They organized communal cooking to maximize nutritional efficiency. They maintained their education classes and athletics program even as hunger intensified, insisting that maintaining routine was essential for morale and survival. Dietrich watched men grow gaunt but remain organized, and felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't performance. This was actual institutional culture, resilient under stress, producing behaviors that contradicted everything he had been taught about American weakness and individualism. They weren't strong because they were well-fed or technologically superior. They were strong because their system, whatever it was, produced cohesion without requiring authoritarianism. How did you fight an enemy like that? The psychological effects manifested in unexpected ways. Dietrich began dreading his interactions with Russian prisoners in Section G, where conditions were deliberately brutal. Starvation rations, minimal medical care, casual violence that the Wehrmacht hierarchy tacitly approved through indifference. The contrast with the American compound was morally unbearable. Both groups were enemy prisoners. Both threatened the Reich. Why did one receive treatment approximating Geneva Convention standards while the other was left to die? The official answer involved racial ideology, subhuman classifications, Bolshevik threats. But watching the Americans maintain dignity and order while Russians starved meters away, Dietrich couldn't sustain the ideological framework. Either all enemies deserved decent treatment or none did. The middle position, that some races merited humanity while others didn't, collapsed under the weight of observed reality. Lieutenant Harrison noticed the guards changing too. Dietrich had started bringing small extras, a newspaper in English, occasional cigarettes from his personal supply, warnings about upcoming searches or command inspections. Nothing that compromised security, but gestures that suggested respect rather than contempt. Other guards followed similar patterns. They stopped using derogatory terms for the Americans. They enforced rules with consistency but without malice. Some started learning English, engaging in conversations about home, families, the world after the war that everyone now acknowledged was ending badly for Germany. Harrison mentioned this during an intelligence committee meeting. Are they trying to build goodwill for post-war trials? Someone suggested. Possible, Harrison thought, but incomplete. He had seen Dietrich's face when Russian prisoners were mentioned. The disgust and shame that the Oberfeldwebel tried to hide. The man was having a moral crisis, recognizing contradictions his ideology couldn't resolve. The Americans weren't doing anything to cause this beyond existing, maintaining their discipline, treating guards with professional courtesy, demonstrating that enemy didn't have to mean monster. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was simply being obviously decent. The camp commandant, an aging Prussian colonel, made a rare inspection of the American section. He walked through barracks, observed the organization, reviewed the self-governance systems, and said nothing. Later, Dietrich overheard him tell Weber, "They're more orderly than some Wehrmacht units I've commanded. How is that possible?" Weber had no answer. The question haunted them both. If Americans, supposedly weak and undisciplined, could maintain military bearing under captivity and starvation, what did that say about the supposed superiority of German military culture? What did it say about everything they had believed? April 1945. The intelligence subplot crystallizes. What the Germans didn't fully realize, what Dietrich suspected but never confirmed, was that the American organization served multiple purposes beyond survival. The Intelligence Committee, led by Major Thomas Bancroft, had spent months mapping the entire camp. Guard rotations, weak points in the perimeter, supply schedules, communication systems, political tensions among German personnel. They had compiled psychological profiles of key guards, identifying who might be sympathetic, who was fanatically Nazi, who was simply exhausted, and counting days until the war ended. They had established contact with resistance networks outside the camp through bribed guards and coded letters. And they had organized an escape apparatus that could theoretically move dozens of men through planned routes toward Allied lines. But they didn't activate it. Bancroft made the calculation that escaped prisoners in Germany's collapsing interior would likely die, shot by desperate SS units, killed by vengering civilians, caught in artillery bombardments as fronts dissolved. Safer to maintain discipline, survive, wait for liberation. The escape planning served different purposes, maintaining morale by giving men something to hope for, keeping analytical skills sharp, demonstrating to themselves and the guards that they remained dangerous despite captivity. It was psychological warfare through competence, showing the Germans that Americans could organize sophisticated operations even as prisoners. Dietrich intuited much of this without proof. He noticed how American officers always knew about command decisions before official announcements, suggesting intelligence networks he couldn't locate. He noticed how escape attempts from other sections always seemed to coincide with times when guard attention was diverted, coordination that suggested the Americans were helping British and French prisoners without directly participating. He noticed that the Americans asked questions, casual, seemingly innocent, that probed for information about German military dispositions, supply problems, morale issues. It was intelligence gathering disguised as conversation. The remarkable thing, Dietrich didn't report most of this, partly because he couldn't prove it, partly because doing so would trigger Gestapo involvement, torture interrogations, executions that would violate whatever remained of military honor, but mostly because he had begun, privately guiltily, to admire it. This was professional soldiering, maintaining mission focus despite adverse circumstances, using every available advantage, keeping your forces effective and your enemy off balance through discipline and intelligence rather than just violence. It was what the Wehrmacht had once aspired to, before ideology poisoned military culture. Watching Americans conduct covert operations in plain sight, Dietrich glimpsed what German military tradition might have been if it hadn't subordinated itself to monstrous purposes. Late April, the weight of impossible choices. The news from the fronts arrived in fragments. Official Wehrmacht communiques claiming strategic withdrawals, British radio broadcasts, intercepted via hidden radios the Americans had built from scavenged parts, reporting wholesale collapse, and the evidence of chaos visible from the camp itself. German units retreating eastward, some still organized, others fragmenting into bands of desperate men, refugees flooding past, civilians fleeing the Red Army's advance, carrying everything they owned. Allied aircraft overhead constantly now, unchallenged, dropping propaganda leaflets that promised fair treatment to Germans who surrendered. The Reich was dying. Everyone knew it. The question was what happened in the messy interim. Dietrich faced impossible decisions daily. Orders came from Berlin, typed on official letterhead, signed by officers whose authority was increasingly theoretical, demanding that prisoners be evacuated eastward ahead of Allied advances. But eastward meant into Soviet territory, where American prisoners would likely be lost in the chaos, murdered by SS death squads, or trapped in a collapsing front. Dietrich delayed, made excuses, claimed transportation shortages. Hauptmann Weber supported him tacitly, both men understanding they were committing insubordination that could mean execution if hardliners in command discovered it. Lieutenant Harrison watched this play out with analytical attention. The Americans had prepared for multiple scenarios: orderly liberation by Allied forces, chaotic liberation during which they might need to defend themselves, or worst case, evacuation marches that would turn into death marches. They had hidden weapons, not many but some, constructed from scavenged materials or stolen from careless guards. They had organized rapid response teams. They had medical supplies stockpiled. They were ready for violence if necessary. But Harrison noticed that Dietrich was also preparing, not to fight, but to surrender. The Oberfeldwebel had started wearing his Wehrmacht uniform without Nazi insignia, a subtle signal that he identified with military rather than party. He had ordered guards to maintain discipline, threatening severe punishment for anyone who abused prisoners as the situation deteriorated. He was, Harrison realized, trying to hand them over safely to Allied liberators, thereby earning leniency for himself and his men. The calculation was nakedly self-interested, but also decent. Dietrich could have followed orders, marched them east into probable death, and claimed obedience as defense. Instead, he was gambling that treating prisoners well would matter when the accounting came. Harrison hoped he was right. The alternative, that decency in wartime meant nothing, that all Germans would be judged collectively regardless of individual actions, was too cynical to contemplate. Early May 1945. The escalation toward endgame. The camp swelled with new prisoners as frontline units collapsed. American, British, French, even German soldiers who had deserted and sought refuge in POW status, rather than face SS execution squads hunting defeatists. The organization strained but held. Captain Morrison expanded the command structure, integrating new arrivals, establishing protocols for overcrowding, negotiating with German administration for additional resources that barely existed. The Americans shared their Red Cross supplies with recently captured men who arrived emaciated and traumatized. They extended their self-governance systems, maintaining order as German authority disintegrated. Dietrich watched American NCOs coordinate with British sergeants and French corporals to manage camp infrastructure that German guards could no longer maintain. Prisoners repaired the water system when it failed. They organized security patrols to prevent theft and violence between national groups. They negotiated disputes using ad hoc tribunals that both sides trusted more than German intervention. It was governance in miniature, rule of law maintained by consent and shared interest rather than coercive force. Dietrich had been taught that order required authority, hierarchy, the threat of punishment. But here was order emerging from horizontal cooperation, individuals choosing to follow rules because the rules made sense and leaders earned respect through competence rather than commanding it through rank alone. The camp commandant, the aging colonel, called a meeting with senior Allied officers. It was unprecedented, formal negotiations between captor and captive as if between equal powers. "The situation is deteriorating," the colonel said in careful English. "My orders are to evacuate before American forces arrive. I intend to ignore those orders, but I need your cooperation to maintain order until liberation." Major Bancroft nodded. "We can do that, sir. We've been doing it." The colonel's face worked with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "You have," he said quietly. "You've been better soldiers in captivity than many of my men are in their own units." He paused. "I wanted you to know. Some of us are ashamed of what we've become, of what we've allowed." Bancroft met his eyes. "You're making different choices now, Colonel. That matters." The colonel looked like he might weep. Instead, he saluted, a precise military salute offered to enemy prisoners, and they returned it. Dietrich, observing from the door, felt the world shifting. This wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement that the Americans had won not just through material superiority but through moral authority, through demonstrating that their system produced better soldiers, better men, better outcomes even under the worst circumstances. May 7, 1945. Convergence of victory and reckoning. Word spread through camp before official announcement. Germany had surrendered. Unconditionally. Completely. The war in Europe was over. In the American compound, the reaction was subdued. Relief, certainly, but mixed with awareness of friends lost, the atomic weight of survival guilt, the strangeness of victory achieved while imprisoned. They sang the national anthem, voices rough with emotion, then settled into waiting. Liberation would come, but in whose form? American forces approaching from the west? Soviet forces from the east? The difference mattered enormously. Dietrich gathered his guards, 18 men, most of them older, wounded, or ideologically moderate enough to have been assigned rear duty rather than final desperate defenses. "We will maintain order until relieved," he told them. "We will protect the prisoners. We will surrender properly, as soldiers, not as criminals fleeing justice." 2 guards deserted that night anyway, fearing Soviet capture or war crimes tribunals. The rest stayed, motivated by some combination of duty, fear, and the faint hope that their treatment of prisoners would earn consideration. The Americans organized a celebration, what celebration was possible with limited food, and invited the German guards to attend. Dietrich accepted hesitantly, finding himself in the surreal position of drinking ersatz coffee with enemy officers who treated him with awkward courtesy. Lieutenant Harrison approached him. "You could have run," Harrison said. "Why stay?" Dietrich considered. "Where would I go? Germany is destroyed. My home is probably rubble. My government murdered millions." He met Harrison's eyes. "Here, at least, I know what I did. I guarded prisoners according to proper military standards." "That's something. Not much, but something." Harrison nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, and I'm not sure how much it's worth, you were decent. You and Weber and most of your men. That's worth documenting." Dietrich didn't know if that was promise or threat. Documentation could mean exoneration or evidence for prosecution. But Harrison seemed sincere, offering what absolution he could. Recognition that individual actions mattered, that not all Germans were equivalent, that moral distinctions existed even in total war. The strange alliance held, prisoners and guards maintaining order together, waiting for liberation, existing in a liminal space where categories like enemy and captor had become negotiable. They had built something unexpected, not friendship exactly, but mutual respect born from watching each other behave honorably under stress. It wouldn't survive the post-war accounting, but for a few days, in one collapsing camp in Bavaria, it was real. May 10, 1945. Preparation for uncertain futures. American forces arrived mid-morning. Infantry from Patton's Third Army. Young soldiers who looked impossibly fresh and well-equipped compared to the gaunt prisoners and exhausted guards. The liberation was anticlimactic. German guards laid down their weapons. The camp commandant formally surrendered to an American captain barely old enough to drink, and suddenly the prisoners were free. Except they weren't, quite. They still needed processing, medical evaluation, transportation arrangements, debriefing by intelligence officers who wanted to document everything about their captivity. Major Bancroft organized the transition with the same competence he had brought to captivity. The Americans provided medical care to prisoners of all nationalities, shared their supplies, established a provisional camp administration to manage the chaos of thousands of suddenly liberated men. They assisted German civilians in nearby villages who were starving, despite those same villagers having presumably supported the regime. Harrison watched this with complicated feelings. Vengeance would have been understandable. Instead, American soldiers distributed food to hungry children, treated injured civilians, maintained order without brutality. It was discipline extending beyond self-interest, the same institutional culture that had maintained order in captivity, now expressing itself as generous victory. Dietrich and his guards were separated for interrogation. Not harsh interrogation. Interviews, really, conducted by American officers who spoke excellent German and seemed more interested in understanding than punishing. They asked about camp administration, treatment of prisoners, knowledge of atrocities elsewhere, political affiliations. Dietrich answered honestly, holding nothing back. He described the Russian prisoners' treatment with shame. He documented the orders he had disobeyed. He named officers who had been cruel and those who had resisted. When asked about the American prisoners specifically, he said, "They were the most disciplined soldiers I ever encountered, including German soldiers, including myself." The interviewing officer, a lieutenant colonel with intelligence insignia, studied him. "Why do you think that was?" Dietrich had had weeks to consider this question. "Because they believed in what they were fighting for," he said finally. "Not just victory, but the system they came from. They trusted it, trusted that it worked, that it was worth preserving, that maintaining its standards mattered even when no authority enforced compliance. We had to be ordered to be disciplined. They chose it." He paused. "That's the difference between conscription and conviction." The officer made notes. "That's going in my report," he said. "Might help at your tribunal." Dietrich nodded, hoping it would, knowing it might not matter. Justice after total war was unpredictable. June 1945. The direct confrontation with totality. The full documentation arrived. Photographs from liberated concentration camps, survivor testimonies, evidence of systematic genocide conducted by the regime Dietrich had served. American officers showed these materials to German POWs and guards alike, not as punishment but as education, ensuring that denial would be impossible. Dietrich looked at images from Dachau, 40 kilometers from Moosburg, close enough that he could have driven there in an hour, and felt his identity collapse. He had known, abstractly, that terrible things happened, but knowing and seeing were different. This was industrial murder conducted by his countrymen, wearing his uniform under his flag. Lieutenant Harrison was present when Dietrich saw the photographs. The German's face went gray, hands trembling as he held images of skeletal corpses stacked like cordwood. "I didn't know," Dietrich said, voice broken. I knew there were camps, but not this." Harrison had heard variations of this claim from dozens of German prisoners and civilians. Sometimes it was false, convenient amnesia. Sometimes it was technically true but morally inadequate. They hadn't known specifics but had chosen not to investigate what their willful ignorance allowed. With Dietrich, Harrison thought it was genuine. A soldier who had followed orders, maintained his small corner of decency, and deliberately avoided looking at the larger horror his service enabled. "What do I do?" Dietrich asked, not really expecting answer. "How do I live with this?" Harrison had no answer. He was 23, raised in Ohio, educated in schools that taught clear distinctions between right and wrong. This situation, collective guilt, individual culpability, the question of how decent people served monstrous regimes, exceeded his moral framework. "You live with it," he said finally. "You acknowledge it. You make sure it never happens again. That's all anyone can do." They sat in silence, former captor and former captive, both trying to process the magnitude of revealed evil. The camp discipline that had impressed Dietrich, the American ability to maintain order and humanity under stress, now appeared in new context. That discipline emerged from a society that, for all its flaws, had never attempted genocide. that had built systems restraining power rather than concentrating it, that had maintained checks on authority even during total war. The Americans weren't better humans, but their institutions produced better outcomes. The distinction mattered. It was perhaps what the entire war had been fought to prove. July 1945, the apex of transformation. The tribunals began. Dietrich was classified as Category 4, followers, those who had served the regime without committing specific war crimes but bore general responsibility. He faced no prison time beyond the months already served in American custody, but received denazification requirements, re-education programs, loss of certain civil rights, permanent employment restrictions. It was punishment but not revenge, justice calibrated to distinguish between architects of atrocity and those who had enabled it through service or silence. Before his release, Dietrich requested a meeting with Major Bancroft. They met in what had been the camp commandant's office, now serving as American administration headquarters. "I wanted to thank you," Dietrich said awkwardly, "for documenting the treatment here. It helped at tribunal." Bancroft nodded. "You earned it. You and Weber and most of your men behaved correctly." He paused. "But I need you to understand something. That's the baseline. That's the minimum. You didn't torture prisoners, congratulations. That's not heroism. That's basic humanity." Dietrich absorbed the rebuke. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, just I wanted you to know that what I saw here changed me. Watching how your men maintained discipline, how your system produced that discipline without requiring what we required, it made me question everything. I'm not grateful for captivity, but I'm grateful for that lesson." Bancroft's expression softened slightly. "Then take it home. Rebuild Germany as something better. That's the only redemption that matters. Using what you learned to prevent repetition." They shook hands. An imperfect closure to an imperfect situation. Dietrich left American custody carrying copies of the Federalist Papers, the U.S. Constitution, and de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, materials Bancroft had recommended. "Understand what produces the discipline you admired," Bancroft had said. "It's not genetic or cultural superiority. It's institutional design, systems that make good behavior rational and sustainable." Lieutenant Harrison returned to Ohio in August, carrying memories of captivity that didn't fit standard narratives. He had expected German guards to be monsters. Some were. He had heard stories from other camps about brutality and murder. But at Moosburg, he had encountered ordinary men trapped in an extraordinary situation, capable of decency when institutional frameworks permitted it. That complexity, that recognition that enemies were human and humanity didn't equal innocence, would shape his understanding of international relations for the rest of his life. The world was more complicated than propaganda allowed. Accepting that complexity was the beginning of wisdom. The final meeting happened in September, after most prisoners had been repatriated and most guards released. Harrison, delayed by military bureaucracy, found himself still in Germany as occupation administration organized. He encountered Dietrich by accident in Munich, both men navigating the city's ruins, now just civilians in a destroyed landscape. They recognized each other across a rubble-filled street, and something in the recognition demanded acknowledgement. They found a cafe that somehow still functioned, serving acorn coffee and black bread. "What will you do?" Harrison asked. Dietrich shrugged. "Rebuild. What else is there? My home is destroyed. My country is destroyed. I'll help reconstruct something from the ruins." He looked at Harrison. "And you?" "Finish my degree," Harrison said. "Maybe teach history. Make sure people understand what happened. All of it. Not just the battles, but the why. Why Germany fell for fascism. Why America's system was resilient enough to fight total war without becoming totalitarian itself." This was the revelation, the moment when everything crystallized. Discipline wasn't about rigid obedience. It was about internalized standards, strong enough to function without external coercion. The Americans had maintained military bearing in captivity because they believed in the legitimacy of military authority, trusted that following the chain of command served rational purposes, and understood that maintaining institutional standards preserved individual dignity. German discipline, by contrast, had depended on fear and ideology. Remove those supports and the structure collapsed. American discipline was anti-fragile. It strengthened under stress because it emerged from bottom-up consent rather than top-down command. Dietrich had arrived at this understanding through observation, Harrison through experience. Both recognized it as truth that transcended propaganda. Some systems produced better humans, not because the people were inherently superior, but because institutional design either enabled or constrained humanity's better angels. Democracy, with all its inefficiencies and arguments and messy compromises, had proven more resilient than dictatorship because it distributed power and responsibility. When American soldiers were captured, they brought their democracy with them. The habits of self-governance, horizontal cooperation, voluntary discipline. That was why they seemed so formidable even in defeat. "You terrified us, you know," Dietrich said quietly. "Not with your weapons. We expected good equipment, but with your order, your self-discipline. It suggested you were unbreakable, that you would keep fighting forever because you believed. We had ideology. You had something stronger. Conviction born from real consent." Harrison smiled sadly. "We weren't unbreakable. We were just well-trained in institutions that work. That was the lesson. That was what mattered. That was what would shape the peace." Decades later, historians would analyze Stalag 7A as case study in military culture. American prisoners maintained remarkable discipline despite captivity, lower disease rates than other nationalities, virtually no internal violence, sophisticated self-governance structures that impressed even enemy observers. German guards documented this extensively, often with grudging admiration that contradicted official propaganda about American weakness. The records reveal a transformation. Wehrmacht personnel who began with ideological contempt gradually developed respect for enemy soldiers who embodied military virtues they had been taught only Germans possessed. Oberfeldwebel Hans Dietrich lived until 1982, working in Reconstruction Administration and later as a trade union organizer in Bavaria. He never spoke publicly about the war but maintained correspondence with several American veterans, including Robert Harrison. In private letters, he described the camp experience as educational, not in military tactics but in political philosophy, watching democracy function in miniature even among prisoners. "You showed us what we could have been," he wrote to Harrison in 1967, "if we had built our nation on consent rather than command." Lieutenant Harrison completed his doctorate in international relations and taught at Cornell for 30 years. His dissertation analyzed military institutional culture, arguing that American combat effectiveness derived not from material superiority alone, but from organizational structures that empowered initiative and rewarded competence over loyalty. He used Stalag 7A as primary example. Even stripped of equipment and freedom, American soldiers maintained military effectiveness because discipline was cultural rather than coerced. His work influenced post-war military theory and became required reading at several staff colleges. The football pitch at Stalag 7A, where prisoners and guards had occasionally played together in those strange final weeks, was paved over during camp demolition. But the lesson persisted, that discipline without consent is brittle, that institutional culture shapes outcomes more than individual heroism, that systems matter, perhaps more than we want to admit. The Americans didn't maintain order in captivity because they were better humans. They maintained it because they came from a system that cultivated self-governance as habit, that distributed authority rather than concentrating it, that trusted citizens with responsibility and usually saw that trust returned. They had arrived as prisoners and left as educators, teaching their captors that true strength doesn't require cruelty, that order emerges from justice rather than force, that the most powerful weapon is demonstrating through action that your system produces humans capable of remaining human even when stripped of everything except character.